perspectives. I'm not positive what they're going to talk about, except that we picked folks that I thought were very knowledgeable on this program to give some community perspective, and our speaker, Peter Cohen, who will be up second here tonight to talk about affordable housing. Anyway, I want to introduce Jason Jungreis, Richmond District resident, and we'll inform on this for some comments.
Thanks very much, Rich. Yeah, I just want to make it clear where I'm coming from. These are my opinions. I'm a member of the board of directors for Planning Association for the Richmond and a couple of other civic groups. These are my comments. So I always like to bullet point it up front so you know exactly what I'm about to say. First and foremost, there's already plenty of housing in the pipeline that's been approved in San Francisco. Secondly, the Richmond is not the place for wise growth in San Francisco. And third, you will ruin the quality of life of the Richmond district if you grow here. So let's talk about the first thing first, the pipeline. We need a little background. For about the last 50 years in San Francisco, the population of San Francisco has grown by about 50,000 people a decade. We have 950,000 people in San Francisco now. But here's the crazy thing. We added the last 50,000 in just the last 4 years. Suddenly we're growing very fast. So, what housing do we need for the growth that we already have predicted? We've already got over 50,000 units that have been approved in San Francisco. Over 50,000 are already approved in the pipeline. That's enough for 125,000 more people. That's the next 25 years. Already in the pipeline, already approved, already happening. The problem, as you can see, is that suddenly we're trying to plan for everybody to come to San Francisco. It just doesn't work that way. If we went back to the natural growth of San Francisco, we already have plenty of housing. Point number 2, wise growth. I am an environmentalist. It's my professional practice in what I do as a clean technology attorney. It's what I believe in. It's actually what I practice in my life. And I can tell you from an environmental perspective, where do you want your growth? You want your growth where there are jobs, where there is transit, and where there is access. That's the east side of the city. Not here in the Richmond. Thirdly, neighborhood character. We value certain things here in San Francisco. We value the nature of what it is that we have, why it is that we were drawn here. That has to do with neighborhoods that have character. The basic character of Richmond is single-family homes, walkable streets. It is not walking down these claustrophobic canyons with tall buildings on both sides of us. There was a publication by the city, I saw it recently, that talked about, among other things, density. And it talked about, I thought this was just fascinating, comfort. And it said that, well, the ratio of the street to the heights of the building along the street, the comforting ratio is 3-to-1. That if you have a 80-foot wide street, for instance, they were talking about here, you would want to have a 6-story building there, because that's more comforting than a 3-story building. That is not something that I need to be told what is comforting to me. I know what's comforting. I also know what the word bonus means. Here's my little bonus talk. And this is to Kirsten. You had said a few moments ago when you were talking about the Richmond, you'd said, there are nice parking lots ready for development. We know how much parking you need. My bonus is, no, you don't. Thank you.
Community housing organizations has arrived. Would you
Thank you. It took me 15 minutes to find parking. I did ride my bicycle. I had no idea that there would be so many of you. This is great. So I brought 22 copies of a handout. So if you could actually, if someone can take charge of sort of splitting the room somehow and sharing with your friends, and I will be happy to send it electronically to Richard.
Did we collect the cards or are
Yeah.
To circulate. This is something that planning and the mayor's office have had for a while. It's nothing new to them. So I'm going to review what we've been, as we call them, questions raised that we've been talking about now for the last several weeks. But I'll start by saying thank you, Richard, for asking me to be here this evening. My colleague Fernando Marti and I are co-directors of the Council of Community Housing Organizations, sometimes known as CHOO. We've been asked to a lot of meetings, frankly. We've been spending a good deal of time over the last probably 6 weeks or so with organizations, neighborhood organizations, various kinds of constituent-based organizations, trying to help folks understand what this is all about. And I think, I know Kirsten and Jeff quite well. This is complicated. There's a lot of moving parts, as they say, and I think that in and of itself can be very overwhelming. So I think what we try to do is help break it down a little bit. Also have a perspective and an analysis and a critique through a set of policy lenses, which we think is an important role that we play as CHOO in the public policy discussion. So we don't have a formal position. Just want to make it really clear. We don't oppose the legislation. We also don't support it. We think there are a number of changes that need to be made to improve it. So the role we're playing right now is to, again, kind of provide some constructive criticism. So if that's circulated around enough, you can kind of share with your partners. We came up with these really kind of 7 policy-based questions. And I think, frankly, staff has gone quite a way in thinking about how they can modify their legislation eventually to deal with some of these things. Those amendments haven't been brought forth so far, but we know that they're actually thinking about these things seriously and probably even have some solutions in mind. But the first one, I'll just take them in order, is just really raising the question about, you've probably heard, I wasn't here for the presentation, that the city has to do this in some shape or form because now state law is requiring San Francisco to implement a density bonus program. And a court case in the county of Napa finally, if you will, created the new rules that the city has to come in compliance with. Well, it's true at some technical level. There was a court case in Napa County. We actually know the attorneys who filed the case. They are pro-affordable housing attorneys. They were not, if you will, thinking about San Francisco. Napa County is a very different place. They, generally speaking, have a very strong kind of cautious, if not anti-development culture. I wouldn't say that about San Francisco. And so the overall kind of policy and political framing of that case was not about every jurisdiction in California. It wasn't about San Francisco. The interesting thing, though, that came out of that was the court ruling had statewide implications. And the court ruling was that now inclusionary housing, which is a law that many cities in California use to require developers to provide some below-market units, has to intersect with this thing called the state density bonus, which basically was designed many years back to encourage jurisdictions that are kind of anti-development to, if you will, to compel them to provide more affordable housing. So again, we don't in San Francisco necessarily need density bonus to be pro-development, or for that matter to get affordable housing. But those two things now have to intersect. Inclusionary housing and state density bonus. And so the city has been trying to figure out how to deal with that decision of the courts. But I say this, and I belabor it a bit to recognize that our position is the city is not under some great threat. There are not lawyers out there who are prepared to sue the city of San Francisco like they were Napa County because of a lack of compliance. The city has time. The city has a good political strength here. The city has a very good legal argument as well because of how pro-development it's been. So what's really important is to get it right and not feel like somehow there's a hammer over the city's head. That is our analysis. That said, let's talk about the proposal that's on the table. The question number 2 is the city getting enough in exchange for the density bonuses or the development bonuses. You've heard about the various conferred bonuses. There's the extra height, there's the ground floor increase of height, there's the reducing of the density control, there's reduced parking, there's reduced setbacks and all this kind of thing. It's a big puzzle of development incentives in exchange for this 30% formula. We've been digging into it, and I don't think there's yet a quick, easy answer. But we argue that it's important to do real due diligence because if the point is, and I won't quote the planning department saying they're not leaving a penny on the table, right? They're capturing back from private development just about everything they've given away to incentivize. We want to make sure, all of us, that you're getting every penny back, right? It should be a good deal, especially in a time of a hot market. There's no reason to be conferring extra value that the public is not getting in return. So whether 30% is the right number or not is the question. It may be, but we want to make sure that it's not just taken for granted as high as it can go. That also leads to question number 3, which is, are the income targets right for what's being called affordable? Now, this is a larger policy debate in San Francisco. The old definition of affordable housing was really for low-income folks and extremely low-income folks. And for many, many years, that was the primary need in San Francisco. As real estate has become just completely off the charts expensive, we now have more and more people who are shut out of the private development market. Our philosophical position is we're not going to build our way out of the problem. By adding 10, 20, 30,000 units of market rate housing, prices will not come down. But the fact is that housing is getting more expensive, and a broader range of folks are finding themselves shut out of the housing market. So the definition of affordable housing does need to expand, but we need to be very careful about what those numbers are, what that expanded range is, and not just turn it into sort of what sounds good politically or throwing numbers around. And we think that the so-called middle income targeting is quite high. It's all of the bonus units, as you've heard, are between 120 and 140 of the area median income. Now, I'm sure there's some folks in this room whose household incomes are in that range, but just to give you an idea, for a family of 3, let's say, that's somewhere in the neighborhood of 110 to 130 or $35,000 a year. That's so. Not to say those folks can afford those downtown Soma condos, but that's a very different demographic of folks than our traditional low and very low income housing, and frankly for other parts of what you might think of as middle income, right? It used to be that, a lot of the folks in the trades were middle income, right? They weren't necessarily low income, but that was San Francisco's middle. But that's quite a bit lower than those numbers you just gave. So the question number 3 we have, and again, we haven't come up with a proposal yet, but we've just called the question of whether they've got it right, is you can see the little diagram we put together. This is actually from the city itself and the Mayor's Office of Housing. I think it's a really illustrative diagram because it shows you, kind of like Mr. Rogers, the people in the neighborhood. There's the firefighter and the landscaper and the dishwasher and the civil engineer, and they all make a neighborhood, and they all make different money, right? This is the reality. And therefore, they can all afford different cost of housing. And so when you think about that broad range of folks, you can see, just by what we diagrammed it, that when all the bonus units are at the upper end, between 120 and 140% of the median income, there's a lot of folks in the middle who are kind of left out, effectively. They're not going to be able to afford these new affordable units. And where do they go? Because they're not eligible for our traditional low-income housing. So we've kind of created a new middle within the middle of folks who are top and donor pool. So we got to be really careful about this in policy terms, is sort of setting these, what we call income targets, the right way, or spreading them around enough so that there's a lot of more households who benefit from this, rather than kind of deciding, well, these folks are the middle now. And if you're below that middle, then you're kind of in this gray zone. So again, that's something for you all to consider. Question number 4. Also about, if you will, getting it right down into the weeds. So there's the income, the affordability unit, but there's also what kind of unit is it? We've heard a lot about the need for more family housing in San Francisco. We've heard about the loss of families in San Francisco. Interestingly enough, the loss of families in San Francisco demographically are much more low-income families and traditional working-class families than it is, the families at the income levels I just mentioned. I think what I'm seeing is those are the families that want to move to San Francisco. And there's nothing wrong with that as folks come to the city with more money, but we are losing families, and they tend to be what we're traditionally low and working class or moderate income families. But nevertheless, family housing is something, right? I mean, if you want to expand and have children, we call that a family. And I'm very careful because I know we use the word family in San Francisco, and folks define that in a lot of ways. But size does matter. And so if we're trying to use this as a program, not only for the middle income, but for family housing, you want to be thinking about the size of those units. I think the proposal is 40% of the units should be at least 2-bedroom. That means the other 60% are going to be studios and 1-bedrooms. And I can pretty much guarantee you there's no economic reason at all that a market rate developer would build any more than the 40% required. It just doesn't make economic sense. You get the most value, if you will, by having smaller units. You can sell more of them and you get a margin more. So 40% 2 bedrooms or more. The other 60% are singles and studios. And then of that 40% 2 bedrooms, one of the things we've called out here is we don't really have standards for what the unit size is. So it's 2 bedrooms, but you're seeing 750 square foot 2 bedrooms, which is a fairly small 2 bedroom. And maybe that's the new urban reality. But you all, in thinking about some of these things, should think through these details. What is a truly family-sized unit so that it has room to move, and importantly, the life cycle of a family can be accommodated as you grow in size. If you have 1 kid or 2 kids, or if you have intergenerational living, grandma comes to live with the family, those things matter because it's the difference often between people being able to stay in place for a period of time as they go through a life cycle versus suddenly outgrowing your unit and having to find someplace else to go. So again, thinking about family housing and whether this is really deliverable.
Did someone park outside in a Toyota Highlander and you're blocking someone in?
Not me, man. I parked 4 blocks away. No, it's okay. And I just got a couple more. I'll try to speed it up. Question number 5, and this gets into some broader issues. So those were some very detailed things which I think matter, but the broader issues. Question number 5 is about the development review process. If you look deep into this, and I imagine the staff presented this, that part of, if you will, the trade-off for this program is also a, if you will, reduced approval process. Projects that comply with the program will not have to have a conditional use approval or otherwise approval by the Planning Commission. They'll have design review by the Planning Commission, but the approval of the project, and we can be corrected in a minute, the approval of the project itself will happen at an administrative level, and the Planning Commission will be primarily design review. Is that good or not? It's up to you all to decide. It also will not have a discretionary review appeal opportunity. Those are going to be precluded as far as our reading of the legislation. So again, is that the right kind of trade-off? So the process for review of projects, as well as the role that the public plays in the approval process, are important considerations aside from the bricks and mortar of what you're getting. The sixth question has to do with supporting infrastructure for growth. And I think planning staff has zeroed in on the certain soft sites that might actually happen. But the larger question is, as growth is planned in other parts of the city outside of the eastern core, which is probably where 70-75% of all the development's been in the eastern part of the city, as development is really encouraged in the out parts of the city, is there the infrastructure, primarily transit, to match that growth? And that's a big part of what neighborhood planning has done in South Market and the Mission, Upper Market where I live, is to make sure that there's investments in transportation and pedestrian safety, etc. So this may be a slower pace, but it still raises the question of how are those kinds of infrastructure improvements going to happen to accommodate the growth. Lastly, you see, these are a whole bunch of questions, right? And I'm sure planning has all the answers. And lastly, and frankly, I think, I'm hoping we're very close to resolving this issue, because I think from a policy standpoint, it's really a bottom line, is you have the potential risk of having existing rental housing demolished for new development. And that's not something that our organization or many organizations want to see happen. Now, there's been a discussion about this at the Planning Commission, and I know staff's looking at, should they figure out a replacement requirement, and the bonus units are on top of replacing the existing rent control units. But then what do you do about an existing tenant when they have to be relocated for, development takes anywhere from 18 to 24 months, and when they come back, and the complications, frankly, of being able to bring a tenant back into an existing unit versus protecting that unit from being demolished in the first place. It's a big, thorny policy issue in San Francisco in general, and this proposal just falls right into the middle of it. So how that will be resolved, I don't know, but we basically said no rent control housing should be lost in the course of this. And lastly, and somewhat similarly, is the question about existing commercial businesses. Everybody's going to have their favorite store, even if it's that single-story place that's fixing tires and stuff like that, which from a developer or planner standpoint might say, well, that's an incredibly underutilized site. It is, right? But it raises a challenging question. Do some of these local businesses, your little retailer or your auto place, are those just something that goes in the course of development and growth? And so figuring out how to make sure that you're either protecting those small businesses or giving them a place to relocate or somehow maintaining the small business character of your community is another big thorny policy question. So that's the scan. There's a lot of issues, and I don't know if they've captured where you folks are, but I'm happy to take questions after.